Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first of our Chifley Conversations for 2022. Tonight, we've got Associate Professor Dr. Sally Weller and Senator Tim Ayres joining us. And there's Sally's joined us and Tim has now joined us. First of all, I'd like to begin with a welcome to country. The office of the Chifley Research Centre is located on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I'm speaking to you tonight from the land of the Dja people of the Kulin Nation. Sally Weller is joining us from the land of the Wurundjeri people, and Tim Ayres joins us from Parliament House, which of course is located on the land of the Ngunnawal people. So we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where we are speaking from, and those on the lands from which you are joining us tonight. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. So, welcome to the Chifley Conversations 2022. Tonight, we're discussing whether regional and industry sector transitions can be made to work in Australia and how we should be thinking about them, particularly in a post-pandemic world. We'll be looking at a number of examples, hoping to draw some lessons and possibly identifying some future challenges. And we'll be asking some questions about the realities, what makes for a successful transition, details of the macro levers and the micro interventions, and what people might be looking to do with those sorts of interventions, what happens to people in chronic poverty, and whether COVID might have a marked impact or indeed any impact on dealing with such transitions, and particularly things like climate change transition. So joining us are our principal guest, University of South Australia Associate Professor Dr. Sally Weller, and to offer some responses, current New South Wales Senator Tim Ayres. Sally's an economic geographer with considerable expertise in interpreting the ongoing restructuring of the Australian economy. She's got, I think, more than 60 papers to her name, published around the world in peer-reviewed journals, and has conducted a range of consultancy projects for governments, unions, and business clients on these sorts of events. Tim, of course, apart from being a senator, is a former AMWU official, and he is indeed been a strong advocate for doing more to lift the focus on the concerns of regional Australians in particular. So he's had to deal with a number of transitions at both community and workplace level. So I'll start with Sally. Sally, would you sort of like to give us a bit of an overview of the field, as it were, and what's happened, what's likely to happen, what's good and what's bad?
Thanks, David, and thanks for inviting me along. We've been doing industry restructuring in Australia now since 1983. I think there's been more than 20 major restructuring packages over that time. We know a lot about how to do this. Most of the packages have been targeted at specific industries. I did a study back in the 90s on the textile and clothing and footwear industry, which was basically dissolved by the trade liberalisation. Then I did a long study of the ansett workers, which was a completely different situation because their jobs just disappeared overnight with no warning. So it's a completely different sort of transition. I did a study of farmers that lost their farms in the Murray-Darling. I now have a major follow-up study of automotive workers in Geelong, Melbourne and Adelaide. And I also have a major project called Firm Birth and Death in Troubled Regions, which is looking at what happens to all the other businesses in regional Australia when a major anchor firm falls out, who survives, who doesn't, how we can help other firms continue. So the just transition literature is really quite new. Comparatively, because the structural adjustment issues have been about transitions for a long time before this new language came. There's a lot of parallels, but some differences. Maybe if we introduce the slides that
yeah, we can
move on
do
to that.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to have these slides just to keep us on track a little bit. I thought I'd talk about the way that just transition is contested, some of the elements of a just transition, and then the possible impacts of COVID. Keeping in mind that COVID is not my area of expertise, so I'm really adding the COVID angle from not a position of strength. Next slide, please.
You'll do well.
So just transition is a really, really contested concept, and it means lots of different things to different people. The words just and transition sound fairly benign. It gives you the sense that it's a safe and secure thing that's going to happen, and we're going to travel to something new in quite an easy way. But in fact, it can be quite dramatic, and it can be quite life-changing depending on where you live and how you earn a living. It can be fast and slow, as I mentioned, asset versus automotive, but it can also be an issue of where the governments want to speed it up to get it over with, or slow it down to give more time to adjust. There are some complex questions about the territorialisation. Do you target what you do for a transition just at the people who are immediately affected and their neighbourhoods? Or do you do it at a bigger regional level or a whole town? And do you stick with the territorialisations that we have at the moment, the existing town definitions, or do we make up some new ones that might be more fit for purpose? And if we do that, how do we deal with that, because it's also sidesteps our established democratic systems? There's lots of issues of constituency. Who gets a say in these things? Is it only the people that are affected, the workers, the unions, the businesses, the governments? Or how does the community get a say? And when the community gets a say, which parts of the community get a seat at the table? And how are the interests of potential future residents and stakeholders represented? So there's some really complex questions there. How to transition equitably. Again, all the questions repeat. How do we avoid, in a labour market based on market forces, the effects of a transition ending up with the poorest and most vulnerable people in the community holding the can, as all the jobs ratchet down and the most able workers get the best jobs? So there are equity issues that go much further than the actual event that's happening, because it ripples out through other places. Next slide, please. So this slide, I won't have time to explain it in any detail, but basically we can identify 6 different approaches to understanding what just transition means. I've ordered them on this slide from the degree to which they have faith in market forces. The structural adjustment interventions that we're most familiar with are within this Keynesian state-led intervention to restore growth, which I've got in the middle of the table here. But there are a lot of other options as well. The important point I want to make is that these different approaches have a different vision of where we want to get to, and a different understanding of how the economy works, what the levers are and what things need to be done to make it work better. And the key point is that these don't map onto our existing political parties, and you'll find elements of these in all of the parties. And that's why we get so much confusion about just transition and what it involves, because people will be using the same words and often meaning quite different things. Next slide, please. But of course, can we go to the next one, please, before this? So I want to suggest that maybe we don't need to agree on those 6 different approaches, that all we need to agree on is what needs to be done and leave the others behind. What needs to be done, I think, is the model we've got has proven a practical success. It's well established in policy. There's a high level of familiarity and support for it within the public sectors and the departments of both federal and state public services that matter. And it's something we know it's accepted, I think, through the unions and through the community that this sort of intervention does have a role to play. It's often called like a de facto regional policy, our crisis intervention system. For it to trigger it, we need the government, federal government, to agree that decarbonisation is a state-instigated structural change, the same way as trade liberalisation was. And then we could treat all the effects as a planned and coherent strategy to deal with it. Next slide, please. So that has 4 elements that are tied to each other through the coordinating arrangements. Coordination is really difficult. If you think of the Latrobe Valley, it's had a Latrobe Valley Authority, which has been very top down. It's been able to get stuff done really effectively, but there's been a lot of worry about exclusion of the community. On the other extreme, Collie has had in Western Australia, has had a very localised group of people working on it, and the state government has agreed more or less to support their decision-making structure. Hunter Valley looks like it's going for something in between. A lot of the literature, a lot of things I read in international conferences are really very strongly emphasise the localisation of these processes, so local communities take ownership of them, so everybody gets to play a part, so there's consultation and involvement. The problem with that is that we don't have any money or power here in Australia at that local level. So here most of the effective structures have got some form of multi-level governance, which means all 3 layers of government plus community all working together in a balance that makes sure the community voice is being listened to, but also that brings the external resources that are required to get something done. With transitioning workers, we've got massive expertise now. Probably the automotive sector transition was the best practice. I think the thing that they did better than anyone else was diffuse the fear and anxiety that accompanies a major closure by managing it in a way that people stayed with it till the end and left feeling proud of what they'd done. The very generous redundancy and termination payments available to those workers made a great deal of difference to that, of course, but they also got quite good counselling support, resume writing, recognition of prior learning, building their portfolios, everything you could think of that could be offered was made available. Still, only 50% of them have jobs as good as the jobs that they left. Transitioning regions is a perennial problem. The state Victorian government threw $300 million at the Latrobe Valley between 2016 and 2020. It created a lot of short-term jobs, building stuff and building infrastructure. It has not managed to attract a single major employer that would be offering long-term jobs. And there were lots of problems with contractors coming to build infrastructure projects, bringing their own workforces from the city and excluding local workers who are perfectly qualified to do the jobs. We have a lot of work to do in working out effective ways to transition regions. Transitioning industries, we've got a lot of experience in the automotive sector. The federal and state governments went into factories and worked with employers to find out the business's strengths and weaknesses, to look at their financial position, to examine options for diversification, to fund new equipment, to fund retraining, export market development. They really tried to keep businesses alive and to find new ways for them to operate. In the fossil fuel sector in Muswellbrook, where I was doing some work last year, they're trying to turn the coal mine into a pumped hydro station with battery support. This is thinking of ways to repurpose the old sites to make them places that can create new jobs. Still, we've got a lot of disadvantages in Australia that make these things very difficult to do, but there is a great deal of will and a great deal of capacity on how to do them. Can I skip back to the COVID slide now, please, which I think is 2 back. So COVID is not my thing, but I think there are 5 real issues that are coming up. I think that a lot of the indications are contradictory. It's disrupting globalization, certainly, but I'm not sure if that's going to lead to more localized opportunities or to global supply chains tightening up and excluding us even more. Work-life balance, obviously, it's been dreadful for women with young children, but where it will go if people go back to the office, I've got no idea. It's accelerating the industrial revolution. There's more digital commerce. People are more comfortable with interactions that don't have people in them. Platform economies are exploding. Robotics is becoming more accepted. There are many changes that we haven't processed yet in that space. Undermining worker protections, lots of things happening, people not being able to work, people being asked to go to conferences when they think they're going to die on the aeroplane. I mean, really scary things happening with worker protections. And of course, increasing inequality. You can see it in your neighbourhoods. Some of us are in our nice study working on our nice computer, and other people are walking round and round in the street because they've got nothing to do and no money. There's a lot there. I don't know whether COVID will be lasting enough to need a structural adjustment type package to deal with COVID. And that's a question because at the moment, all our structural adjustment packages have really been targeted at small crises where you can throw a lot of money at something, but this is a big crisis that goes everywhere, so it won't be able to have that same response. So that's me probably over time. I've got one last slide at the end that gives some things that are about this and some links to where you might find papers. Libraries have all this stuff though, usually. Type my name in. So
thanks very much for that. Thanks, Sally. That was very comprehensive. And for those in our audience who are interested in following up, I mean, obviously you can see the material on the screen now, but we will post that on our website so that people have got a more leisurely opportunity to go through what's on the screen and find the links. And we'll do that overnight once we've received the recording of this session. I'll come over to Tim now. Tim, what's your response to all of that? I mean, Sally's saying that there's a strong model, but in executing the model, it obviously depends on the perspective of the people who are pulling the levers, and she's illustrated a range of perspectives, all of which require a bit of distilling, and you're in a place where it all gets distilled.
Well, look, g'day. Thanks very much for that. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners as well. And of course, all of these approaches that are particular to their historical circumstances and engage with how in not just in the academic world, but in the policy making world, people conceive of what the role of government is. I really enjoyed that presentation. And of course, I reflect on my own work in the manufacturing sector. You know, there have been innumerable factory closures and engineering facility closures over the course of my long career in the manufacturing sector. And those experiences never leave you. They are intensely difficult. And you know, they leave their communities impoverished, and workplaces like that are just not sources of work. That they are also places with great social infrastructure. You know, people build their lives and their families' lives and their interactions with each other through their unions and with their supervisors, building and making things that you know have real social value as well as their economic value. Of course, I do think it's very important to separate out what is a sort of emerging debate in the academy and and at a global level from what, of course, people are focusing on now, which is, some of the issues around climate and energy. And I don't believe that from a sort of political and policy making perspective, that kind of framework is the right kind of framework for the country now. And I just want to explain why. Some of the concepts are very important and well understood. Our job as a federal parliamentary Labor Party is to win an election and to then govern in a way that makes the country stronger, and in particular some of the regions that Sally is talking about are stronger. The areas that have been affected by the auto closures, big parts of Western Sydney and outer metropolitan Melbourne and Brisbane, where manufacturing industries have disappeared, where job opportunities have gone, and there are enormous opportunities, though, in the economy and the country and the circumstances that we face. Our opponents, both the government, the Liberals and the Nationals, and of course in the Greens political party, agree that the Just Transition framework's a great political framework to talk about these things, because they want to create the idea that jobs and opportunities are going to be stripped away from people. The truth in all of these regions is that, of course, there is, firstly, coal exports will continue for some time, and the future of the coal industry is very strong for a period, and then, of course, it will be entirely a function of what happens in global markets for thermal and metallurgical coal. And it will be a function of what happens in the market, and be a function of what agreements international governments meet. There will be, of course, in addition to that, enormous opportunities in Australia in fixing the electricity grid, in new generation and storage opportunities, in the export of energy. You see these enormous projects like the project in the north of Australia, whose name I've just forgotten for a moment, Sun Cable, I think it is, exporting power directly to Singapore. Very significant Australian deposits of the minerals that are critical for the manufacturing of generation and storage, in no small part lithium, but other minerals, co-located actually in significant parts of Queensland and Western New South Wales, where there are big opportunities, not just for mining and the export of commodities, but for Australian manufacturing of, in particular, battery storage. The opportunities that can be driven by an active government, if we get this framework right, the drive down energy prices, it's good for households, but also very good for rebuilding investment in Australian manufacturing. And despite what I saw from a couple of my friends who are sort of centrist economists, scepticism about the future of an Australian automotive industry, enormous opportunities in electric vehicles. So there are enormous opportunities and very significant challenges, and the task of an Albanese Labor government will be to put those things together, in my view. Climate and energy is obvious, and that there are, the modelling that we did of the ambitious policy framework that we set out in climate and energy says more than 600,000 jobs that can be delivered. Now, making sure that investment is targeted towards the regions where that can generate the most benefit is an important task of government. But that is not a just transition story. That is a story about building new jobs and new opportunity and new manufacturing and new engineering for Australia. But put aside climate and energy, in food and agriculture, in manufacturing more broadly, in digital, in health. These are enormous industry opportunities, and it does, let alone the social, the big social challenges, aged care, disability care, turning those jobs into good jobs. And that does require a modern conception of the role of government. Government as not as a sort of fixer of market failure, but government as a key actor, solving national problems, using our public research capability, our capacity for innovation, for providing education, a new framework for industry policy, real partnerships with industry, like genuine partnerships with co-investment. I am very attracted to the framework that Mariana Mazzucato set out in some of her work, where we attach some of these big national missions and engage government in solving those issues. That's why there's a $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund and a $20 billion Rewiring the Nation Fund. These are the biggest commitments that an opposition has made on its way into, into coming into government for industry policy and for rebuilding Australian capability in the nation's history. They involve real partnerships, opportunities for co-investment and cooperation. And I don't dismiss anything at all that Sally has said, and the enormous body of work and activity that's gone on, not just in Australia, but overseas, looking at what happens, particularly on a regional basis as some of these industries go out. But I'm excited about the opportunities for real change and real activity that generate real long-term good jobs for Australians in the regions that we've got. No small part, of course, there's an election coming up just around the corner, and it's a chance for us to deliver some of these things. I think that's a great opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to the challenge. So thanks, David. That's probably, again, like we always go over time, don't we? I probably did, but that's my 5 cents worth, if not 5 minutes worth.
Okay then. Well, look, thank you for that, Tim. And I'll just say we're just starting to get a brief flow of questions and comments. For those who do have questions, I'll put them to our panelists. If you can just direct them to the Q&A function rather than the chat function. That's not to discourage people from having a chat and having a conversation about the themes that emerge. But look, I suppose, first of all, I go to Sally for a bit of a response to that. I mean, crudely, it seems to me Tim's putting, in strategic terms, he's putting an approach that we should be taking, or government should be taking, a strategic developmental approach to future sources of employment and having confidence about particularly the benefits that can be derived from a climate transition, rather than taking a strategic approach of preparing to deal with the consequences of change post hoc. Preparing early to deal with something afterwards, the repair job or the restoration job. What's your response to that? Because, I mean, as Tim said, there will be issues at a more micro and community level and a regional level where the new opportunities may not flow right away, if at all. And you did make some points to deal with infrastructure about, workforce mobility and which workforces are mobile and which workforces are not in these cases when you have transition.
Look, I agree with most of what Tim said about the role of government to stimulate things. I think that the only way for Australia is that co-investment Mosquito approach. It's proven over and over again that private capital is not going into Australian regions without a lot of arm twisting to get them there. I see that as the third prong. The rebuilding of industry is the third prong, but we have to be retraining people to meet that challenge. And at the moment, we're not doing that. Tim will know there's been a couple of major reports this week outlining the sorts of things he just outlined, and they stress really the need to get the training system working again to fill people into those jobs. There's still the problem of how you get things to go into those vulnerable areas, and whether there's going to end up being a sort of a competition between the vulnerable areas. You know, you might have seen some of those maps that have hydrogen in 3 of the 12 vulnerable areas and show how really successful those 3 areas will be, and never mention the 9 that don't get the hydrogen plant again. You know, I think Tim's right. I don't share his confidence in regenerating automotive, and I don't share his confidence in regenerating manufacturing until the global situation changes from where it is now. But I certainly agree that we need to be doing our best to stay in the game. So if we do get into a situation where we can compete internationally against imports, that we'll be able to do it.
Just before I sort of pick up some questions or points that Richard Bentley's made, and in a similar vein. I mean, he's asking, particularly what do we do about retraining, relocating, and building new industries to ensure that opportunity exists in those areas where there might be, I suppose, friction in the change, or not the immediate, as you suggest with hydrogen, not the immediate answer coming out of certainly a climate change transition. What should we be doing to prepare if we're not dealing with our traditional micro level, or not so much micro level crises, but contained crises, I suppose, where you might have one plant go, or a particular industry or a town, or whatever. This seems to me that we are facing transitions that are going to be a bit more broad brush, albeit with quite specific regional and community effects. So how do we plug those gaps, as it were? What's the best way?
Look, I mean, for my part, there's a couple of things in there. Firstly, but I mean, rebuild TAFE. We have 140,000 less apprentices than we did when this government started. So rebuilding TAFE, like, it is absolutely the engine room for education in the regions. Lots of our kids want to go to university. That's a good thing, but TAFE's got to be an attractive, good option for young people they want to go to, and that involves rebuilding the institution. Secondly, 600,000 jobs, just as a result of the commitment that we've made around our midterm targeting and net zero by 2050. That is an enormous opportunity. Most of those jobs are in the regions. Now, except you can't sort of micro target, town by town, exactly which jobs where. They are contingent on infrastructure and all sorts of other things that are going to determine where they are. But there are enormous opportunities in that kind of industrial investment, let alone all of the other things that we can do. Think about food and agriculture. The lowball ambition of the Industry Association in Agriculture and the Morrison government is to lift the value of Australia's agricultural exports up to $100 billion by 2030. That's it. They're not interested in whether that's exporting commodities overseas or exporting value-added food products overseas, but that's where the big opportunities are. Lifting Australian agriculture up the value chain, diversifying our product offering around the world. That's where the big job opportunities, and those job opportunities are in regional towns and our outer suburbs, and in places like the Western Sydney Airport, where if we get these things right, there will be enormous opportunities for Australian farmers and Australian manufacturing businesses. I I'm optimistic about what we can do in manufacturing if we drive down the cost of energy. That is the thing, the rising cost of energy, along with a couple of other issues. That was Australia's advantage for a long time. We've lost it. We have an opportunity with the clean energy revolution to drive down energy prices, not just for consumers, but for business. And there's a lot of opportunities there too.
Sally, do you have a similar take on things?
I agree with all of that. Except I'd like to add, though, that one of the problems we've had with TAFE over the last 15 years is this dogged skills in demand issue. You know, we only train people if there's something staring us in the face that needs a job. And you know, if you think of what Ireland did in the 80s when it trained up all its young people in digital skills and exported a workforce to the world, I think we should be looking at country towns as generators of skilled, creative people to export to the cities and to other places, and build the education system, not with an idea just to plug a particular job vacancy, but to build people that are going to fill the vacancies of the future, and we don't even know what they are now, which is building creativity, building skills to work things out, things that TAFE used to do a lot better back in the days of the industry restructuring, and we lost it over the 10 years or so of cutting back of TAFE.
Yep. Just on that, I mean, that clearly requires a bit of consensus of people who are running things and deciding how institutions like TAFE operate, and perhaps a bit of pressure from communities and regions who want to be, you know, forward-looking. Tim Moore's asking, could either of you comment on the role of distributed coordinating authorities, such as the one currently proposed by the Hunter Jobs Alliance, in bringing a local focus to these transitions that can have a positive effect on the regions? I mean, I suppose that's about solving some of the things that you put a finger on earlier, Sally, which is the money and the power sits centrally within our federal system, but it's applying it at the local level that sometimes makes these things more effective rather than not effective. How do you deal with that? And do distributed coordinating authorities work? And if they do, what's the best model?
My short answer is no. I did a bit of work for the Muswellbrook Council in 2020 and 2021. And one of the things that was most astonishing to me about all that year I spent doing a lot of work up there was the absence of the state government. In contrast to all the work I've done in Latrobe Valley, where the state government is smothering the local and organising everything. They just weren't there. And if they're not there, their money's not there either. And there were really well-developed local plans and a lot of consultation with the firms as well. And some of those plans were quite well advanced and then got undermined by the New South Wales Energy Roadmap, which was not consistent with what the locals were doing. You really got to have the multi-level coordination and the power relationships in place. That, you know, I understand what the Hunter Valley model is, and I think it needs stronger federal and state representation.
Right. And in terms of how you deal with these things, John McQueen's asking, you know, is there a different approach for a regional area versus a suburban fringe area or a suburban actually niche, you know, a large metropolitan centre, you know, like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane? Do you take quite distinct approaches for a contained region as opposed to something on the fringes of the big metropolises?
Yeah, well, the big metropolises have so many more employment opportunities. Bad effects from closure events happen when you've got lots and lots of people competing for the same job. which happens in small country towns because you've got the whole workforce of the factory with similar CVs, and there are not many jobs that suit their CVs. In a big city, those people are spread over a larger amount of available jobs, so it's much less of an issue. You don't have to do so much targeting in the local area. There are also lots of opportunities that don't exist in the regional areas. And when we take Geelong as an example, has absolutely boomed since Ford closed. And that's because Geelong had already been targeted by the state government as a growth centre to take the pressure off Melbourne, same as Newcastle and Wollongong have been in New South Wales. So those effects of the other policies having effects on development in the areas which create jobs which actually have nothing to do with the industry part of it, but do create more opportunities.
Look, I reckon we need more cooperation, not less. At the national level, at the industry level, and I do think there's a role for regional institutions to get this right. Like, it does make regions stronger. You look at an area like the Hunter, the legacy of all of that cooperation between unions and government and business in the Hunter is still visible in institutions in the Hunter, 20 or so years after the closure of BHP, and it's has long-lasting benefits. Some of the engineering and innovation capability that still exists around there as a result of that kind of long-term investment. But it also needs a government that's getting the economic fundamentals right and driving towards some of these objectives. So just today, the President Biden stood up with the CEO of a Brisbane-based Australian manufacturing firm and has announced that that firm will be essentially relocating to the United States to make electric vehicle batteries. That's 500 or 600 jobs. And now, you've got a government over there that's got the scale and has got the ambition and is making the investment happen. And it's, again, a story about Australian innovation and capability and jobs drifting offshore because the government's just lost the plot with focusing on this. Too busy fighting sort of political battles about climate and energy policy rather than getting these sort of fundamentals right. So, like a lot of these things, David, I think it's sort of about getting both things right. We have lost a lot of that capacity to cooperate across business and trade unions and government and our other big institutions, and without rebuilding some of that, without a bit of sort of working together, then it's going to be hard to make some of these other things to make real progress. Yeah.
Thanks for sort of drawing that point out, Tim, because it provides a good segue for something that's been going on in the back of my mind while we've been talking. Sally made a not dissimilar point, albeit from quite different levels of example, when we were preparing for this talk. And then she was telling me that in some of her experience, some of the better transitions where there's been a firm level crisis occurring have occurred when the firm that was actually exiting a region or a sector came early to government and was involved very much in the delivery of some of the transition package. Sure. and quite obviously, some of the compensation package too. I mean, everyone has a self-interest. But what I think both the things that you said are, pointing to this notion that you need collaboration between labour and capital, as it were, and government. And I find this fascinating because I was at an event yesterday with the chair of a major Australian bank, who, unfortunately, for the purpose of this conversation, I can't name because it was under Chatham House rules, but he was as optimistic, if not more optimistic, than you have been tonight, Tim, on the potential benefits of a well-managed climate transition. And indeed, he believed that it could confer or restore advantage in terms of things like energy costs, but also create new competitive sectors for Australia. And he cited the example of the institutional part of this bank increasingly encountering Japanese investors who are just desperate to invest in Australia in things like renewable energy, but also the industry that can feed off it, because they recognise not only do we have a lot of space and a lot of sunshine, but unlike particularly Korea and Japan, we have it through most of the year and most of the day. And they say, well, they just cannot possibly do that or come up with an energy alternative that would match it. Therefore, they're going to have to import off us, possibly, and we're a place to invest. Now, as you made the point earlier, at the very start, Tim, this is a contested field at the moment, and there's particularly Labor's opponents, and I don't want to make this, too binary a political discussion. It's in their vested interest to talk down anything that holds out the vision of a successful energy transition, and that in turn makes it hard to build a consensus, and it probably makes it difficult for business investors to do the same. And we also lack some of, the tripartite structures that we might have had in a more traditional Australian industrial relations environment. So I'm asking both of you, how do we achieve these things? Sally, I suppose, first of all, at the enterprise and community level, how do we build this sort of consensus and forward thinking, and indeed use it to force things like a reconsideration of TAFE? And then we might throw to you, Tim, for the macro take on this question.
If you don't mind, I'm very sorry to do this, but I'm going to have to run down to the chamber. There's some developments in, not quite a vote yet, but some developments yet in an important debate that's going on at the moment. That's a conscience vote on mitochondrial legislation. So I might just say this and then vanish, if that's okay.
Sure.
Business gets it. The trade union movement gets it. The industry associations, the finance community, they all get it. There is no disagreement. The insurance industry gets it. There is no disagreement amongst all the actors except for the government. There is enormous. We agree on the opportunities. We agree on the challenges. If you go into any boardroom in Australia, there are thousands of managers and leaders of Australian businesses who will have exactly the conversation, David, that you had with that chair. We just need a government that's prepared to make it happen and to build that cooperation and to do it in the interest of the community. Like the sky's the limit, really, in terms of the opportunities. It'll never be easy, but we're facing a big rest of the century with enormous challenges for the country in economic terms and in strategic terms, and the future's ours if we just grab it, and everybody else is prepared to grab it. The only missing partner is the federal government, and you wouldn't think it's a politician if I didn't say there's an opportunity to change that in just a few months. But look, thank you very much for the discussion. I've really enjoyed that. I've been following the chat. Really good contributions. Sally, we'll have to meet properly next time you're up in town.
Okay, great.
See you later.
Good to meet
Bye.
you. Yeah, see you.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Well, Sally, that's a perfect segue to you now. Well, it's the only segue.
I do wish that everything Tim has said was true and achievable, but I'm not as optimistic, and a lot of the things are not actually prevented by the federal government. They're prevented by global conditions, and those conditions will still be there after the election. So I think we've got a lot of challenges, and I agree the renewable space is where we actually do have a comparative advantage internationally because we've got sun. So that has to be the real core, I think. And if we had cheap energy and abundant cheap energy, we would have firms coming back.
Yeah. Well, look, we might sort of close out on that note, and I'll pick up a question from Bob Crawshaw, who's saying that, you know, when you are having to make a quite deliberate and defined transition, you know, as opposed to the broader one we might be doing around climate, how long does it usually take? Does it take 5 years? Does it take 10 years? What, or can you indeed measure it?
If you look at a graph, if you're talking about workers, if you look at a graph of what happens to workers, almost all of them are settled into a new pattern in 2 to 2.5 years. That pattern, of course, might be a whole series of intermittent labour hire gigs, but they will be in a pattern in 2.5 years. So the worker transition takes about that long. The regional transition, you know, the changes we made in 83 are still, have not finished unfolding in regional towns. So they're taking place over a 50-year horizon.
Right.
The industry changes, if you think of the automotive industry, really the global financial crisis and the things that were happening in the global financial crisis were the nails in the coffin. And then it took 5 years to die, and still there are firms struggling on. We don't know if they're going to survive or not. Perhaps if we have a government more supporting manufacturing, they will be able to survive, but that is still unfolding as well. Yep.
Okay then. Well, look, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for giving us your time tonight, Sally. You know, these things always require a bit of preparation, and we do appreciate that. Obviously, we thank Tim too, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. It's been an interesting discussion, and certainly let me conjure with a few things. I mean, I think as Sally's pointed out, what's at play is not only in contest, but it's a lot more complex and nuanced than many of us sometimes imagine when the events actually unfold and there's the clamour to do something about them. So thank you very much. As I said earlier, we'll have a recording available of tonight's event, hopefully as early as this evening, if not overnight. And with that, we will post the links to some of the work that Sally has done. As we go through this series of Chifley Conversations this year, we'll also be posting partial transcripts and summaries of what we've been discussing. So I hope everyone can join us. We're aiming to have most conversations on a Wednesday night. That won't always happen due to circumstances, but that's the rough aim. Otherwise, we'll be going for Thursday nights. Next week, at the same time, on the 16th, we'll be joined by Abel Rizvi, who last year produced a book, Population Shock. Abel describes himself as a population and immigration nut, and also in parenthesis, a Collingwood supporter. We'll be dealing with the former rather than the latter, and discussing not only his book, but also drawing on his expertise as a former Deputy Secretary of the Immigration Department to divine what's going on with both population policy in the broad and immigration as a subset. And indeed, we'll be touching on some things like how we manage both population policy and immigration policy from a skills perspective versus the alternatives of dealing with, for example, the TAFE sector. So I hope everyone can join us for that next week. And then shortly after that, Andrew Lee will be joining us to talk about automation. And at the start of March, we'll be joined by Gareth Evans, who's got a new book out about international citizenship. So all in all, we've got a good series lining up, and we hope you can join us. Once again, thank you, Sally. Thank you, everyone, and good night.